تتلوها أخرى دمعة تتلوها أخرى من هموم.
بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. It's my real honor and privilege to host this event on an extremely important topic, which relates to the Nakba, and our guest speaker who's come all the way from West London to be with us today is Dr Azzam Tamimi. I'm sure most of you know who Dr Azzam is, but for those who aren't so familiar with his history, Dr Azzam Tamimi is a Palestinian himself. He was born in Hebron, which is in the West Bank of Palestine. When he was around 7 years old, him and his family, they moved to Kuwait. Kuwait was one of the areas that many Palestinians were forced to flee to, both after the Nakba and then after the Naksa as well. And in fact, it took a large portion of Palestinians who helped, in fact, build the country up. Dr. Azzam has been part of the Islamic movement for longer than most of us have been alive, mashallah. His contributions to kind of Islamic works and to this deen are extremely profound. He's an academic. He's written a number of books, a very important book on the history of Hamas. And he's the founder and a presenter on the TV channel al-Hiwar, where he hosts a range of discussions around kind of trends that are taking place within the Muslim world. Dr. Azzam, Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum assalam. Well, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So, the Nakba itself, it's known as the catastrophe. That's what the word means. It's got this almost symbolic nature for not only Palestinians, but for all of us as Muslims. And it's important that we hold on to that word, this idea of this catastrophic moment that has happened in our history, because yes, there have been many other incidents of terrible violence against the Muslim world. But I don't think that there is a single moment in our history, in our modern history, that encapsulates our weakness as a ummah and the impact that our weakness has had as much as the Nakba. It is, I would say, the intertemporal point, the seminal moment, the key moment of our contemporary failure. And that's why it's so important that we hear from people who not only have studied and try to understand this moment, but who have been physically impacted by the consequences of the Nakba. Dr. Azzam, I guess my first question is, could you give for those people in the room who aren't so familiar with the history, an idea of where does this idea of the Nakba really stem from? What was its genesis?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Salatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa man wala. It's really a pleasure, a great pleasure to be able to come and see you and talk to you about this issue. Now, your introduction is actually very important because you emphasize the specialty of this cause, in a sense. And this cause is quite special simply because it's not domestic, it's not regional, it's actually universal. Now, to appreciate this, we need to go a little bit earlier, about half a century before the Nakba, to appreciate the context of what happened in 1948. Because the Nakba happened in 1948 when the Israelis or the Zionists declared their state in Palestine, and it is actually around this time that last week actually they celebrated it in the Hebrew calendar. In the solar Gregorian calendar, it will be next week sometime on the 15th of May. But it wasn't really a day or a week. This happened over a long period of time because it involved the dispossession of an entire community of Muslims from their historic homeland. Now this has to do with two things. The origins of the problem is to do with two things. First, a problem that Europe had and couldn't solve. It's called the Jewish problem. Europe had a Jewish community, and they hated the Jews and they loved the Jews. They wanted the Jews and they didn't want the Jews. This dynamic continued with them, often resulting in pogroms or in massacres committed against the Jews. In recent history, the most famous ones were the ones in Russia, called the Russian pogroms. Then they were followed by something called the Dreyfus Affair in France. Then culminated to the Holocaust. And the Holocaust is a fact of history, and it would be very stupid on the part of any person to deny it, because we can see it. You just go to Europe and you can see. And this is the reason for this, is that the Christians of Europe blamed the Jews for the murder of their God. They claim that the Jews murdered their God, which is a bit funny, because how can a human murder God? But anyway, this is the creed that they invented. And they wanted to get rid of them, but at the same time, especially in Protestant dogma, the Jews were created for a purpose, and that is to facilitate some of the things the Christians needed and couldn't do themselves. So it was some sort of a dilemma. So there was a Jewish problem, and the Europeans wanted to solve that problem. How do you solve that problem? Find them a home somewhere. And at the turn of the 20th century, Britain in particular was ruled by a group of Christian Zionists. I don't know how many of you heard the term before, Christian Zionists. Christian Zionists are much worse than Jewish Zionists, because Christian Zionists believe that the Jews had to go to Palestine in order to pave the way for the coming of the Messiah, who would come and then kill the Jews or convert them. But this wasn't enough really to motivate or to have this project going on. The developments that happened in the early 20th century and culminated in the First World War had a lot to do with the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine 50 years later. And that was the bringing down of the last Islamic state, the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Caliphate. The French and the British, to some extent the Russians who worked together in the First World War and brought an end to the Ottoman Empire, wanted to make sure that the Muslims would never ever stand on their feet again. That's why this is where the universality of the cause comes from. The occupation of Palestine, the theft of my mother's house and my father's land, and the scattering of Palestinians around the world, wasn't because they didn't like the Palestinians or because they loved the land of the Palestinians. It was, in a nutshell, because this was a very strategic point in the heart of the Muslim world, and they wanted to create a colonial entity, a colonial edifice, that through which they can be sure that the Muslims will always remain divided as you see them now, useless as you see them now, especially the Arabs. Look at the Arab world. The Arabs, who happen to be all Arabs, speaking the same language, almost all Muslims with a few Christians, are scattered over 23 to 24 stupid, failing states created by the British and the French. We can imagine. This is the issue. With Israel right in the middle, they can guarantee that these Muslims cannot be united again, so long as they are ruled by the likes of Mohammed bin Zayed and Mohammed bin Salman and Sisi and all these collaborators with Zionism, whose primary whose primary role is actually to protect this Zionist entity in Palestine from the Arabs and the Muslims around them. So if you think of Palestine as a Palestinian problem, you miss the point. It's not a Palestinian problem. Of course, you can talk about Palestine from a humanitarian point of view, yes, because there have been injustice, there have been violations of basic human rights of the Palestinians. You can talk about it from a religious point of view, because Palestine matters to the Muslims, Bayt al-Maqdis, Al-Aqsa, etc., Masra Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. All this is important, but this is not the issue. The real issue is this is a Western colonial project using a racist, fascist entity, employing the services of the Zionists, who were originally actually secular Jews, not even religious Jews. Nowadays I go on a tour in the country with a rabbi called Rabbi Weiss, who is from the Naturi Carter group, and we talk exactly about this, that the occupation of Palestine is not a Jewish project, and the conflict is not between the Jews and the Muslims. Rather, it is between those who are the victims of invasion and of occupation and of racism, and a racist ideology called Zionism, which is, for those of you who know, and probably very few of you are of my generation who remember apartheid in South Africa, is very much similar to the ideology of apartheid that was in South Africa, discriminating among people on the basis of color. So I'm sorry I took a bit long. I just wanted to clarify this as a background to why we have this conflict in Palestine.
No, that's really helpful, and I'm really glad that you mentioned the point about, these Muslim states, because, maybe it's just my own view, but, in 1915 you had the Hussein-Makman agreement. So Sharif Hussein, who was the leader of Hijaz, the area that's now known as Saudi Arabia. And then a couple of years later you have the Faisal-Weizmann agreement as well. Now what all of these agreements are doing are effectively saying to the British and saying to the leaders of the Zionist movement that we're willing to split apart from the Ottoman Caliphate in order to establish our own nation states, and what we're willing to do is forego the right that the Muslim world has on Palestine for the sake of achieving that goal. To what extent, do you think that they had a choice in this matter? Like, is this something that was always going to happen anyway? Or was there a moment that, these individuals, these kind of leaders of these Gulf states could have turned around and said, actually, this is an act of khuruj? Because at that time, and I've been to the archives in Malta, and I found shipping manifests of prisoners, of scholars who were being imprisoned by the British because they're refusing to sign a fatwa to say that Sharif Hussein is the Khalifa, right? So this was something that was being orchestrated. Clearly, there was pressure that was being put on Muslim scholars, on Muslim leaders. So to what extent is that moment important in the eventual loss of Palestine?
Well, it is very important, because the British, by the way, were the main players in this. I think the French were secondary, and they were even at one point or another even cheated by the British, because they had certain agreements, and then the British would go and make other agreements and things. That period of time is actually quite interesting. I mean, people who are really interested to read. There's a very interesting book called Peace to End All Peace. It's a very good book. Explains how policy decision making was taking place at the time. But anyway, the British exploited two things. First, the weakness of the Ottomans, and I regret to say that toward the last century of Ottoman rule, it had become a corrupt state. Corrupt, weak, and they were preoccupied with useless things at the expense of the Ummah. And they were neglecting the many parts that were in the proximities. They also exploited the competition among Arab warlords the Al Saud and the Bani Hashim and this and that, and they were playing them against each other. This is the idea of the Hussein McMahon correspondence. It was actually about promising Hussein and his sons a kingdom, an Arab kingdom, extending all the way from Aleppo, from Halab to Mecca. But the British, when it comes to the Arabs, never kept their promises. So in 1915, they had this Hussein McMahon agreement. In 1916, they had the Sykes-Picot agreement. They repeated it in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration. So it was a very dynamic period. But had it not been for the corruption and the willingness to betray the Ummah on the part of the Arab leaders at the time, none of this would have happened. None whatsoever.
You know, obviously, we have a lot of blame to take ourselves as the rest of the Ummah in relation to what happened. But I think we have to acknowledge a degree of strategic genius on the part of the Zionists in the form of a very long-term plan that they had in how they were going to achieve their political and military objectives. So when you think about the fact that in 1901 they set up the Jewish National Fund in order to start acquiring land in Palestine. And then what you see over the next 30, almost 40 years is a systematic process of not only purchasing land, but also, you know, and Ilan Pappé talks about this in his book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, the mapping of every single Palestinian village. And for me, that's one of the most amazing parts of this whole story, and tragic parts of this whole story, that it was scientific, the way that all of the events that led up to the Nakba. So the Nakba doesn't just come about as this random moment. There is a degree of meticulous planning that has gone into it that makes it almost impossible for anybody to counteract, and the day that it happens, or the weeks that it starts. So before we get into the Nakba itself and the Yasin and the early days of it, I just wanted to ask you about that, about the way in which they were able to so effectively not only buy land, but also map all of these villages, because as far as I understand it, it took a lot of help from Palestinians to do.
Well, yes, the Zionists did their bit of planning, but it didn't always work, by the way.
Right.
So sometimes people credit them for more than they deserve. In 1897, Theodor Herzl summoned a few Zionists from here and there in Basel, or in Bâle in Switzerland, and held the first Zionist conference. But actually it was the lowest point for the Zionists, despite that, because at that time most Jews around the world were opposed to him. They even called him a heretic. And to prove him wrong, the Jewish elders in North America met in Montreal and denounced him and said that Judaism and Jews have nothing to do with this project. What provided Zionism with empowerment was this country, the British. Palestine was placed under the British mandate when the Ottomans were defeated and their territory was carved and shared between the French and the British. Palestine was the only entity that wasn't turned into a new state. Iraq was made a state, Syria was made a state, Lebanon was made a state, Egypt was made a state. Of course, all colonized, all under foreign authority, but Palestine was placed under what is known as the British Mandate, legitimized by the League of Nations, which is the precursor of the United Nations. And it was the British who facilitated the migration of Zionists into Palestine, arming them, training them. Actually, they had a division within the British Army which was Jewish, a Jewish division within the British Army, and these are the ones who formed the beginnings of these Zionist gangs that perpetrated massacres like Deir Yassin and other massacres. Under British rule, Palestinians were persecuted. Of course, Palestinians were struggling against British occupation, and then they had to struggle against Zionist encroachment. And it was the British who changed the laws to make it possible for the migrating Jews into Palestine to acquire land. This how it went. And actually this confirms, or there is a verse in the Quran that describes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about the Banu Israel, how if they are ever successful, how that happens. إِلَّا بِحَبْلٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ وَحَبْلٍ مِّنَ النَّاسِ. They are empowered either because Allah wants them to be empowered, or because other communities want to use them, make use of them, and empower them as a result. So you think of this as another British colonial endeavor, similar to the one that happened in Ireland, similar to the one that happened in South Africa, and happened in Mauritius, and various other places in Asia and India, whatever, where they use settler communities. Except for the fact that in this case, they don't use Protestants, they used Jews. And so from here comes the collaboration between the Zionist movement and the British colonial authorities.
Jazakallah khair. So let's talk a little bit about the Nakba itself. For those people who haven't seen it, there's this amazing Jordanian film called Farha. I don't know if you watched it. It's very moving. It's very subtle in the way that it shows and depicts what happens on the Nakba day itself. But the Jews themselves.
Better still, the documentary called Tartura.
Tartura. Okay, I haven't seen that.
It's a documentary produced by an Israeli producer using Zionist archives, and they interview people who were still alive and who participated in the massacres, who were actually took part in the killing. Fascinating.
Yeah, I mean it's amazing exactly how they went about it. So what's interesting is that the Zionists call that period the days of Tehura, which is very similar to the Arabic word Tahara. They call it the days of purification. That's how they refer to the series of massacres that take place across Palestine. What it meant for those people who had to live through that invasion.
Undoubtedly, the Palestinians in the beginning were not really thinking that these Jewish immigrants were going to do this to them, because it was the nature of the Ottoman Empire that it welcomed any persecuted community from all days, even from the time when Spain was lost to the Muslims and the Muslims were driven out and the Jews were driven out. It was in Muslim lands that the Jews were received. At other intervals, when the Jews were persecuted in Europe, it was the Ottoman Empire that received them. Not only Jews, other communities as well. So those coming to Palestine, it was thought that, okay, this is part of the usual. Yet, gradually, they started seeing them forming militias and intimidating Palestinians, inciting them, provoking them, etc. But I think they had in mind something well constructed. The perpetration of a number of massacres in certain points, in certain places, and allow the news to spread as soon as possible. So that if you massacre, say, 100 people, you can guarantee that 10,000 people will flee. So the news will spread, and this is what my mother told me about how they fled. My mother was born in Bi'r Saba, which is in the Negev today, in the south of Palestine. and they heard the news of what happened in Deir Yassin. The Zionists entered into the town and killed everybody, men, women, children. They didn't save anybody, except a few individuals. They allowed them to remain free and forced them out so as to go and relay the news of what happened. Now, what do you do in this case? If you hear of something like this happening in the neighborhood, you pack up and you leave. The Arab governments that existed at the time might have also played a role, because they were promising the Palestinians with protection. We're coming to help you. So if you feel unsafe, just come out, lock your door, and in a week or two you'll be able to return. My grandfather actually did exactly that. They took a few valuable things, locked the door and took the key and went to Hebron, to Al-Khalil, where the rest of the family was living, and they never managed to go back. So it was like an orchestrated plan to vacate the land. About 750,000 Palestinians fled as a result of those massacres. Now, I must also here admit that the Palestinians at the time did not have the knowledge, did not have probably enough faith in themselves, probably did not have the right, what it takes to remain in the land and fight to death, although many of them fought. I mean, my own father, as a 20 years old, joined a group called al-Jihad al-Muqaddas in Palestine, in which my uncle was martyred. Some of them did that, but actually many of them fled, unlike what's happening today. Today, the Israelis bombed the Palestinians, the Israelis starved the Palestinians, the Israelis imposed siege on the Palestinians. You don't see a single Palestinian fleeing or leaving. So it takes some awareness and some understanding of the nature of the project, and also the responsibility, the individual and communal responsibility we have as Muslims. I mean, it's better to die defending your land than live in a refugee camp. Such sentiment was not prevalent at the time among the Palestinians. You know, this whole thing would not have happened to us had it not been for the fact that we were not really that adherent to the values of Islam. Alhamdulillah, today things are much better. Our people are coming back to Islam. Our youth are very interested in Islam. Probably you saw pictures of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa during Ramadan. Although the Arab countries who collaborate with Israel and who met in Aqaba and then in Sharm el-Sheikh wanted to close the mosque in the face of worshippers who wanted to do i'tikaf, the young men entered into the mosque and imposed i'tikaf on everybody. And the mosque remained open 24 hours and i'tikaf was performed. It's a completely different generation from generation that existed 75 years ago. So alhamdulillah, there are very positive signs. We can see things that make us optimistic that inshallah we are nearing liberation and victory inshallah.
And I guess that's one of the things that in all the accounts of the Nakba that I find most deeply problematic, and it hurts to read them and to hear about them, are the accounts of collaboration. And I think Farha does that very well. The movie really, in such a subtle way. Then of course you have Amir Habibi's book as well.
Was her uncle, was it?
That's right, it was her uncle in the end. You have Amir Habibi's book, Saeed the Optimist, which does a brilliant kind of exposition of what a collaborator is. And it seems, unfortunately, in so many ways that you can't really extricate the story of the Nakba from some of the collaboration that was taking place. Because when the Zionists entered each town, they knew immediately who the military-age men were, where they lived, how many guns they had in each house, and it was awful.
Yes.
The extent to which they had knowledge. And of course that knowledge could have only have come from one place.
Well, see, this has been our chronic problem. Today, what is causing us so much pain today? It's the collaboration. The Zionists managed to kill the Intifada that erupted in 1987 by luring the PLO into collaborating with them and transforming itself from a national liberation movement into an agency working for the Zionists. Today, the Palestinian Authority, as it is called in Ramallah, actually works for the Israelis. It doesn't protect the Palestinians. Arab governments around us, around Palestine, the people in Jordan, the people in Egypt, the people in the Gulf, in Saudi Arabia, the people even in North Africa, all the way to Morocco, Muslims around the world are dying to come and fight for the liberation of Palestine. Who is preventing them? It's these collaborating governments. So collaboration, these hypocrites, it's a nifaq, this is a phenomenon of hypocrisy. They are the ones, and that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, هُمُ الْعَدُوُّ فَاحْذَرْهُمْ. These are the real enemies. The hypocrites are the real enemies because they're exposing you back to the other enemy, and then they can undermine you and they can destroy you. Yes, collaboration has been with us, but with the increasing level of awareness among the youth, it's not working. Alhamdulillah, it is exposed now, not like before. Before, people couldn't tell who is collaborating and who is not, who is good and who is bad. Today, alhamdulillah, the picture is very clear.
Jazakallah. I want to open up the floor to questions soon, but I think just one last one from me before we ask others about the questions they have for you is, could you share some of the impacts of the Nakba, but more from a personal perspective? How has the Nakba been encoded in your life, in your activism, in your families and those around you? Like, how do we understand the flow of the Nakba into intergenerationally up until today?
A couple of years ago, or maybe more, several years ago, I decided to write my autobiography. So I finished the first chapter and then stopped. I must go back and complete it. In the first chapter, I say, I am the child of the Nakba. Why I say this? Because actually, I would not have been born had it not been for the Nakba, because my mother comes from Bi'r Saba, my father from Al-Khalil. When they were forced out of their home, came to Al-Khalil, that's where my father saw her and he admired her, and it was love at first sight, and that's it. That's when I was born. I was born in 1955. Nakba was in 1948. Now, yet, I actually interviewed for my program. I have a program in al-Hiwar called Muraja'at, where I interview people with important experiences to share with the audiences. And I interviewed several people who actually were driven out of their homes in 1948 and still remember vividly what happened to them. They saw their neighbors being killed. They saw horrible things being done to the village in which they used to live. We're talking about 500 villages completely destroyed. Towns completely vacated, or half vacated, or 3/4 vacated. And how they had to struggle moving at night, during the day, from one village to a village until they reached a safe haven somewhere in the West Bank, which was to be occupied much later in 1967, or in Jordan, or in Lebanon, or in Syria. Now the refugee camps, Palestinian refugee camps, are in the West Bank, in Jordan, in Lebanon, and Syria. And we're talking about 5 to 6 million Palestinian refugees and their descendants. And for every one of us, someone like me, my mother always spoke about her childhood before they were driven out. So it becomes part of my story. My father always talked to me about the struggle in the jihad against the Zionists al-Jihad al-Muqaddas, you can hardly find a Palestinian who doesn't have a story to tell, either the story of his parents or of his grandparents. And we are keen to tell these stories because this is how we maintain the thing going on. I was born after the Nakba, but my children, my mother taught me and my father taught me, I taught my children teach their children, my grandchildren, and it just never disappears. And this is why Israel has no future. Israel has no future because in previous, and if you don't mind, I'll just say a few things here, just to provide you with the context. Similar colonial projects existed in the past. And these colonial projects ended in one of three ways. We have the example of the Americas, Australia and New Zealand, where the indigenous population was nearly wiped out and the occupiers and the invaders became victorious and established their own culture and their own statehood. We have the example of Algeria and Vietnam, where the invaders were driven out. Algeria, 130 years of French occupation, can you imagine? They changed forcibly their culture, they forced the French language on them, they fought ulama, they closed down the awqaf, they did all sorts of things. It didn't work. The Algerian people continued to struggle until they drove the French out. The French even annexed Algeria. Imagine, when the French were occupying Algeria, they considered Algeria to be part of France completely. Just like what the Zionists are doing in Palestine now, annexing towns and villages, etc. A third model is the one that happened in South Africa. In South Africa, the racists realized that their project didn't work. It had to come to an end. So they came to the victims and said to them, will you forgive us? Can we live together and be equal? Can we forget about the past? And Nelson Mandela said to them, if you repeal apartheid, we can live together. And we say the same thing in Palestine, by the way, because we don't have anything against the Jews. Our problem is not with the Jews. The Jews were our neighbors. The Jews lived in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Libya, all over the place. Our problem is with the invading Zionists. So if tomorrow they come to us and say, we are sorry for what happened, for what we did to you, Zionism now we recognize is racism, can we have a fresh start? We say, yes, we can have a fresh start. No problem at all. Alhamdulillah. This is our deen. This is how it's been throughout history. The other problem, of course, they have is that this is not just a Palestinian issue. No matter what, Muslims, all the way from the Pacific Ocean to the shores of the Atlantic, will not forget Palestine. Will never forget Palestine. Because there is a chapter in the Quran that, whether you like it or not, reminds you of how central this place is to our faith. سبحان الذي أسرى بعبده ليلا من المسجد الحرام إلى المسجد الأقصى الذي باركنا حوله. The story of the Isra, the fact that the Prophet ﷺ, Muhammad, when he was being persecuted, when he was in the most difficult of his circumstances, rejected by Quraysh and rejected by At-Ta'if, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes him on a night journey, first to Al-Quds and then to the upper heavens. And in Al-Quds, he assembles all the prophets for him, whom he leads in prayer, as a certificate, as a testimony that this is the final message and you are the leader of this ummah and the leader of all the followers of prophets that preceded you. This is part of our faith. And these idiots, they come from Europe thinking they can just turn it into their own homeland. That can never work. And inshallah, one day, those of you who live long enough, and I think we are not far away from that point, will be able to visit Palestine when it is free and when it is liberated.
Jazakallah khair. In fact, that leads us perfectly to our first question, which has come from the sisters, which is, you said liberation is near, inshallah. Why do you believe this and how?
You see,
the project of Zionism succeeded because we were so weak, backward and divided, and because they were so empowered and united. Now, this is being reversed. You must have heard about what's going on inside the Zionist entity. Now, Jews are demonstrating against Jews. The difference, because these communities, actually, they are not homogeneous. They came from different parts of the world. There is nothing as such as a Jewish people as they claim. There are Yemeni Jews, there are Egyptian Jews, there are Hungarian Jews, there are Polish Jews, there are German Jews, there are Russian Jews, there are British Jews. Now, when they have established themselves and they have a new phenomenon called religious Zionism, which is a contradiction in terms, probably we don't have time to discuss it in detail, they are seeing that this entity is not what they were dreaming of. The differences are appearing on the surface, they're quarreling with each other, and there is reverse migration. An increasing number of Jews in Israel are now actually leaving Israel because they're saying this is not the paradise we once dreamed of. Now, on the other hand, the Palestinians, the Arabs and the Muslims, who were divided, who were backward, who lacked the knowledge and the understanding and the awareness, they are overcoming all of this. And one important sign of this is the Arab Spring. The Arab revolutions that started in late 2010, early 2011, which have been now suppressed a bit, are the beginning of the liberation of the Arab masses. I personally believe that Palestine will be free when the Arabs are free. And the Arabs are not yet free. They are ruled by dictators who are imposing restrictions on them, who are shackling them, who are persecuting them. And the Arabs want to be free. The Muslims want to be free. Imagine when the people around Palestine are free from these dictators, from these corrupt governments, what will happen? You can easily see the liberation of Palestine. And the world is changing. If you look at international politics, the world in which Israel was created in 1948 is different from the world we live in today. The West has different problems, different agendas, different interests. There are other groups emerging in the world. This dynamic is so fast that it seems to me that it is going to speed the outcome that we are all hoping to see, inshallah.
Yes, brother, please.
Assalamu alaikum. You talked about all the problems which are happening all over the Muslim world. But what I'm asking is, what is the solution? If the solution has to be something adopted from the Quran and the Sunnah. Ati Allah wa ati Rasul. So until we as the Muslims adopt the method that Rasulullah adopted when trying to establish the Medina state, and it was done mainly in secret. He went to a lot of places for Nusra, a lot of people. But here in this country, all around the Muslim world, we got hypocrites who are leading our nations. The Ummah as one is trying to look for a solution. And until we all adopt the method of Rasulullah, which one of the brothers sheikhs in Pakistan, Taqwa Deen Nabhani, came with, the solution is only from Rasulullah. Until we adopt that, we will not be you looking for independence from the Zionists or any other. This has to come as an Islamic state in order to just have frontiers but now borders within the state. What do you say to that?
Well, I agree with you. I agree with you.
We've got another question from the sisters, which I might add a little bit to. She asked, what do you say to people who call for a two-state solution? And the bit that I'll add is, particularly when the current formation of Israel as it stands is a settler colonial apartheid project? Like, could there ever be a realistic two-state solution when the central pillar of the Israeli state is on a racist ideology?
Well, to start with, our problem in Palestine is not that we had a state and we lost it. No, Palestine throughout its history was never a state on its own. And actually it cannot be a state on its own unless, like Israel, is funded and supported and armed to the teeth by foreign powers. Who wants a state like this that is incapable of sustaining itself? So it's not a question of having a state. We want to push back the invaders. This is a Muslim land. This is part of the Muslim Ummah. It's been invaded and occupied. And it is our duty to liberate it and also to rush to support our brothers and sisters who are the victims of this invasion. Secondly, the two-state solution is a myth. This was created by the Zionists to start with in order to extinguish the intifada, the uprising, the Palestinian uprising that caused them so much headache when it started in 1987. And I regret to say that they found some Palestinians, like Yasser Arafat and his group, who, because their objective was not actually the liberation of Palestine, but was some sort of a political prestige, joined in this plot, went to Oslo and concluded what became known as the Oslo Agreements, which did not provide even a state to the Palestinians. All it did is recognize the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinians. And by doing so, the PLO could just tell the Israelis, Azzam's mother's house is yours, you can have it. We don't need it. Mahmoud Abbas himself, on the record, on television, he said that his ancestor's house in Safed, he doesn't want it anymore. That's now the Israelis. And then, instead of a Palestinian state that is independent or sovereign as they claim, they turn this into a collaborating agency. They trained policemen, provided them with arms, and told them, your enemy is not the Zionist, your enemy is the Palestinian who is resisting the Zionist. This is what's happening. So, as a Palestinian and as a Muslim, I tell you, this notion of a two-state solution doesn't work for us, is not acceptable, is un-Islamic, it doesn't solve the problem. Because Zionism, so long as it is even in one town, not in a state, is a racist, fascist ideology. Because it believes that Jews are superior to everybody else, and that Jews have a license from God to kill the Gentiles who are not with them. And this is why they're doing this to the Palestinians. I was once watching BBC News, and they had an interview with a lady, an activist, from a settlement near my home in Al-Khalil. And the BBC correspondent asked her, plainly, straightforward, you're living here on top of the hill, the Palestinians are in the valley, you've taken all this land which once belonged to them, how do you justify this? She said, if God did not tell me to do this, I would be a criminal. And you know, it's part of our fitrah, it's part of our nature. If we do something wrong during the day, we cannot sleep at night. If you steal something, or if you harm somebody, if you insult somebody and cause them pain, it will remain on your mind. And you won't feel comfortable. When do you feel comfortable? When you blame it on somebody else. And who is better to blame it on than God? And this is actually what all colonial invaders have been doing. There's a brilliant book, if you can get a copy of it, I would recommend it. It's called The Bible and Colonialism, by someone called Michael Pryor. A brilliant book that explains how that all colonialism throughout history was justified in the name of God. And of course we know, Allahu bari'un mimma yaz'umun. مما يدعون. Allah is innocent from all this. Allah, the God we worship, the God we know, would not tell you to kill your fellow human being and take their land and for just like this because you are superior, because you are white, or because you are Jewish, or because even you are Muslim. Some deviant Muslims fall into this trap, by the way. They say, oh, these are kuffar, it's okay, we are Muslims and these are kuffar. You cannot do this to any human being. You cannot. Aggression, theft, murder, these are crimes, whether committed against a Muslim, or against a Christian, or against a Jew, or against an atheist. You cannot do this. But these guys, from the conquista of America, to the apartheid in South Africa, to Zionism in Palestine, to all the colonial projects in Asia and Africa, they claimed they were God's children and God gave them a license to do this.
Jazakallah khair. Sorry, let me just repeat the question for the sisters. The brother just asked what types of steps the Palestinians should be taking at this stage, considering the impasse that is there politically and the difficulties that arise after taking violent actions.
Look, if your home is occupied by an invader, and if this invader is threatening your life and the lives of your children, and if they bring their own relatives from abroad to live in your own house and throw you out, you have every right to resist with whatever means that are available to you. Now, if reason works, reason is preferred, definitely. You say to them, why are you doing this to me? What have I done to you? Why are you harming me? We know reason doesn't work. It hasn't worked. It might work in rare cases, but mostly these are invaders. They came armed to the teeth and they are determined to take your home. So what do? You resist. I am not in a position, and I don't think that anybody outside Palestine is in a position to tell the Palestinians how to resist. Because they know their own circumstances, they know their own capabilities. They are the ones who are going to pay the price for resisting, because there is a heavy price for resisting. You know, when a brother is accused of threatening the Israelis or of carrying out an operation or something, they immediately go to to his house, they throw his family out of the house and they bomb the house. And this happens regularly, every day it happens. So there is a heavy price. So to decide to resist is not an easy decision. What mechanism and what tools and what means to use is also not an easy decision. But if you imagine yourself in their place, and they are being harassed day and night, and they are being persecuted, their brothers are in jail, or their brothers and sisters are killed, or all these things, sometimes they have no choice but to use violence. They call it violence, but actually we call it resistance, because you did not initiate it. We didn't go to where they were living and attack them. They came to our land and they want to take our homes and they want to dispossess us. So Palestinians have every right to decide how they want to resist. Occasionally we have people from among the Palestinians who say resistance doesn't work. And if we are offered a peaceful way out, we should accept it. If you are weak, you cannot negotiate. If you are weak, they don't really care about you. If they are already stepping on your head, who are you to negotiate with them? And this is what happened to Yasser Arafat and the PLO. They went to negotiate and they had nothing in their hands. To the contrary, they actually offered everything to the Zionists in exchange for only one thing, which is a useless authority in Ramallah, except for collaborating with the Zionists.
Yeah, absolutely. Before I take another question, it just reminds me a little bit of the kind of the power dynamics of the Warsaw Ghetto, because when you're occupying a country, the best way to police the people is from amongst themselves. So you establish a select preferred group. You get them to police
Yes.
the majority. And this is a tactic was used in Rwanda. It's how the whole Rwandan genocide took place. So we see these tactics again and again and again. And actually it makes it a bit difficult because, we watch the videos of Hussam Zumrat on TV, on BBC, and he's brilliant. He's such a brilliant advocate for the Palestinian cause in many ways. But he's also part of an entity that is routinely arresting our mujahideen in Palestine. Whether they're resistance fighters from secular groups, or their brothers and sisters are part of Islamic groups. So we see him and we think, wow, mashallah, he's doing brilliant work advocating on behalf of Palestinians. But, I don't know about his direct involvement, but definitely the PA, the group that he's associated to, are carrying out terrible, terrible oppression against their own people. So how do we kind of square that? Because obviously we want to share his videos. We want people to know and say, look, this is how you advocate on behalf of Palestine. But from somebody who's effectively part of a collaborating group.
Well, Hussam is a talented person. He has a brilliant way of advocating the cause, but it undermines his credibility, the fact that he is on the payroll of Mahmoud Abbas. And I feel sorry for him because he would have been in a much better position had he been independent. Because Mahmoud Abbas is handing over to the Israelis our own brothers and sisters who are resisting, while his ambassadors around the world are trying to advocate the cause. So it's just not easy. And I feel sorry for him because I do recognize his talent and his persuasion ability, but that for people who know exactly what's going on in Palestine, the credibility is eroded.
The brothers are asking about the organization Hamas and the role that it plays in relation to the Palestinian cause and how successful it might have been compared to some of the other Arab leaders in the region.
Well, Hamas, and this is what the book actually endeavors to show, is originally the Islamic movement of Palestine, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan of Palestine. In 1987, when the Intifada started, they decided to transform themselves into a resistance movement, because this was the mood and everybody wanted to resist. Now, if you think of the circumstances they've been through, I think they've been doing very well. They're considered to be a terrorist organization by most of the world. They're boycotted by much of the Arab world. They're fought by some principal countries in the region. They are imprisoned in Egypt, they are imprisoned in Saudi Arabia, they are imprisoned in the UAE. I mean, you can imagine. And financially, they used to be dependent on donations from the general public. Now it's a crime to donate to Hamas anywhere in the world, including in the Arab countries. So it's not really easy. I wouldn't call the Hamas entity in Gaza a state. It's really a status quo created by the decision on the part of Sharon when he was Prime Minister of Israel, just a year before he died, to withdraw unilaterally from Gaza. Gaza was also occupied, just like the rest of Palestine. But Sharon had a plan to withdraw from troubled spots. Gaza was very troubling for him. So he said, let them go to hell. We just withdraw and we build a wall and we have nothing to do with them. And they imposed siege on Hamas, especially since it won the election in 2006. Now in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah has nearly eradicated Hamas because they've given all the information about Hamas members to the Israelis. The Israelis either kill them or put them in prison. So the situation in the West Bank, now they're coming back again in the West Bank because the whole of the West Bank is angry with the current reality. Hamas is under enormous pressure. Sometimes they are left with very difficult choices. Sometimes they are forced to make choices that are not necessarily the best, as you can imagine. I mean, in a situation like that. I personally don't hesitate to criticize them if they don't take what I believe to be the right decision. Because for me, although I sympathize with Hamas, what matters to me is the cause, not the organization and not the person. And it's important that we all do this so that we can help our brothers correct the march as they go on. Recently, there have been signs in the region that things might improve a little bit, especially when Saudi Arabia allowed them to go and perform Umrah, because they've been denied Umrah since 2005. This is the first time they went and did Umrah, but they haven't been allowed to meet with any senior official, so there were no discussions. But Saudi Arabia started releasing Hamas prisoners, because they had about 65 Hamas leaders imprisoned. Because when Mohammed bin Salman came, you don't know what happened to Saudi Arabia. It's just crazy. He put the ulama in prison. He put the rich people in the Ritz and stripped them of all their wealth. It's just crazy. Maybe he's tired of all of this and he's thinking of a different way. I don't know what's going on, but it seems that the relationship between him and Mohammed bin Zayed is deteriorating. And analysts say that it was Mohammed bin Zayed who actually encouraged him to take that route. But now he considers Mohammed bin Zayed one of his enemies, to the extent that only a few weeks ago he closed the borders between Saudi Arabia and the UAE and prevented trucks carrying goods from passing through, and ordered all international companies who have regional offices in Abu Dhabi to relocate to Saudi Arabia, or no business will be done with them. Now, frankly, when I see Arab despots fighting with each other, I love it. Because that opens space. That creates zones of freedom for others.
Jazakallah khair. That's a great point to make. We'll take a question from Mustafa. I'm going to try and take two more before our time ends, inshallah. So the brother was asking about Palestinians in the diaspora who have been very successful in the West, going back to work under Israeli authority in jobs that are based out there, and whether or not there's a bigger picture that we're missing that we don't see.
It seems to me from your question that you are referring to Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship.
Yes.
Now, maybe it should be clarified to the brothers that in 1948, a small minority of Palestinians remained in what became Israel. And until the mid-60s, they were treated as aliens, and they were even subjected to martial law. But after 1965 or 1967, the Israelis decided to give them citizenship. So they've become Israeli citizens, but Palestinians, both Muslim and Christian. Some are Druze, there are Druze also. And they are treated as second citizens. They don't have exactly the same rights as the Jewish citizens, but their position is a bit better than the Palestinians who live in the occupied territories. Now, these Palestinians have no option but to go back to their villages and towns. So they come back, they come out, they study, and then eventually they cannot work in the Arab countries because they are Israeli citizens. They have to go back and serve in Palestine. So it is not out of subservience to the Israelis that they do this. They have really no option. And I can tell you that many of these brothers, their hearts are with us. You saw last Ramadan, not this Ramadan, Ramadan before. Remember the events in Bayt al-Maqdis? Ramadan 2021? The revolution spread in the towns and the villages where the Arabs are Israeli citizens. And Israel got crazy about this because said, oh, these guys have been living with us for so long, they haven't forgotten their brothers and sisters on the other side. So it's quite a complex situation the Palestinians happen to be in.
So the brother's asking about how we might continue to support Palestinians beyond, kind of the moments that it comes into our consciousness during Ramadan. I want to add a question that one of the sisters asked, which is about visiting Palestine to the question here, because a sister, Heb Jamal, she wrote an article for Al Jazeera a couple of days ago, where she warned about the danger of visiting Palestine just to make ziyarah, just for the sake of praying in Al-Aqsa, saying that if Muslims you come, it has to be to take the mission back home, not just to pray in Masjid Al-Aqsa. And I thought it was a very profound article. It's worth sharing around. But I wonder what your thoughts are on what the brother was asking, but also about then maybe kind of Palestine tourism, for want of a better term.
Well, first of all, I must agree with you on the first point that Palestine does really occupy an important position in the hearts of Muslims, and this explains the generosity they show when funds are raised for Palestine. And we need to maintain this and even work on it to increase it, because the needs are enormous. The families that need to be sponsored, the orphans, etc. Now, I think the biggest battle in this country and across the West is the battle for the hearts and the minds of people regarding what's going on in Palestine, understanding the cause and the conflict. I regret to say that many Muslims have been intimidated by the Zionist lobby. They're so afraid of standing up to Palestine or speaking publicly. And this has impacted even on our students. I remember when I was a member of FOSIS, or I remember when I was a member of MAB 20 years ago, we used to have lots of activities, lectures in universities, a week for Palestine, this and that, and interactions. And then when the Zionists started heating up and accusing people of anti-Semitism if they criticize Israel, which is, by the way, not right. If you criticize Israel, this is not anti-Semitism and it's not against the law at all. But they frighten people. Recently in this tour that I alluded to, that I and the Rabbi are doing across the country, 4 to 5 Muslim centers pulled out when they received letters from UK lawyers for Israel threatening them of taking away from them their charitable status. Muslims shouldn't be easily intimidated. We have to fight the fight. These guys are thieves. They are invaders. They are aggressors. You just tell the truth. It is true that sometimes we exaggerate, but we shouldn't exaggerate. I'm against exaggeration. And I'm against using wrong information. It doesn't serve the cause. We have an abundance of facts that we can use in this battle for awareness. So what we really need, and I was discussing this with my son driving here from northwest London, we really need an organization similar to the one in America that is a platform for all those who wish to stand by justice in Palestine. In America they have American Muslims for Palestine. Why don't we have UK Muslims for Palestine? Where people come together, they work together, they encourage the young men. The young men shouldn't be frightened. I mean, I regret to say that some of our students are so frightened of bringing up the name of Palestine. If we do this, the Zionists are winning the battle, are winning the war. That shouldn't happen. If we have the facts, and if right is on our side, we have nothing to fear. Regarding the visits to Palestine, now there's been a fatwa that bans Muslims from going to Palestine. But this fatwa is about going as a tourist to Palestine. People who go to Israel and enjoy themselves on the coast and that's included in the fatwa, because this is supporting Israel. Any visit to Palestine that ends up in supporting Israel should be prohibited. Common sense. But if I go to Palestine to see how our brothers and sisters are doing, to express solidarity with them, to learn about their life and come back and tell others about it, that's very important. We should encourage it rather than discourage it. And I, from my own experience, and I've been involved in this country since 1992, it's almost 31 years now. Brothers and sisters who have been to Palestine come back much more enthusiastic about working for the cause. Because they see, it's different. I may describe things to you, but it's not like seeing. So some brothers contact me and say, I give them even my sister's number in Al-Khalil. I tell them, go to Al-Khalil and see them and sit with them and see them. They come back, oh yeah, it's much, much different. So I would encourage it if it is for this purpose, but not for the purpose of just enjoying oneself and supporting Israel.
Jazakallah khair. We're going to close after one more question because Maghrib Adhan's about to come in. But yeah, the last question is really just asking about what are the biggest lessons we can take from the Nakba. I mean, that's what we came to learn about. What is the advice that you can leave us with in terms of understanding this moment in history and how we can take something from it in our daily lives, inshallah?
I think the most important lesson, and I'll just give this lesson, is that the Nakba was about finishing off the Palestinian issue. It failed, completely failed. It didn't work. Despite all the crimes committed by the Israelis, despite the fact that they scattered so many of the Palestinians around the world, the Palestinian issue is as alive as ever. And that's an important lesson. And it is important to realize that this is an issue, this is a cause unlike any other cause. Because it touches me as a Palestinian, it touches you as a Muslim, it touches an Arab as an Arab, it touches a human being as a human being who believes in justice and human dignity.
Jazakallah khair. I hope that you'll all join me making dua for Dr Azzam Tamimi, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keeps him safe, that he increases in khair, that he makes him and continues to make him a voice for not only Palestinians but for all Muslims, and that he continues to help guide us all towards increased khair for ourselves and for this ummah, inshallah. Dr Azzam, jazakumullah khair. I really appreciate your time, especially coming so far, and especially on a Friday night when it's so difficult to travel. To be with us. Jazakumullah khair, everybody. I really appreciate the wonderful audience we had today and all the brilliant questions that were asked, and to, of course, all the volunteers at Norbury Muslim Center. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.